Hey, it's Drybear. Back again with our Diablo 4 build guide, and today we're going to be talking about my Cleaver Barbarian build. This is a true bleed barbarian focusing all in on bleeding, the bleed dot, as well as ways to detonate the bleeding to cause even more mayhem. Disclaimer, this is theory crafting. I have not tested this at the very end game, so it's more just about getting the creative juices flowing and inspiring you to try the build or try something similar. So if you like the build, but you have other ideas, feel free to modify it. The full build is down below in the description. But first, you should come hang out with me on my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you don't come hang out with me and the community, the next time you walk into a room, you're going to forget completely why you're in there, and you're never going to remember. All right, let's jump into the build. This is the Cleaver Barbarian, focused on primarily bleed damage, generating fury, and we're going to be using Rupture for many different reasons. There's some cool legendaries and even a unique for endgame that scales infinitely with this. So it's going to be super fun to play with lots of dot damage. So if you like making people bleed, this is going to be the build for you. Now we're going to start like we always do at the top of the skill tree. We'll work our way down. We'll explain all the mechanics, all the synergies, all the things to look out for, and then we'll move on to gear and we'll go through a simple Paragon setup for this as well. So since it's a bleed build, we're going to go with Flay. It is your bleed damage ability, but on top of just causing bleed and generating fury, it also can apply vulnerable and increase the damage that targets take from bleeding overall. So this is huge. You need Flay. And most builds don't level their builder just because you're not really using it for damage. But I think in this case, because bleeding damage scales and bleeding damage causes Rupture to do more, you can actually spare some points here. If you want to keep Flay at 1, you can, and there's other passives you can get down on the tree, but I think it is an option if you want to get points into Flay. For the spender, we're going to go with Rend. Easy pickup here. By the way, you can also put in pressure point here. We're not going to have crazy lucky hit with this, but it is an option for extra points. Pressure point works in a lot of builds. So you're going to go with Rend. Rend does a cleave in front of you and applies bleeding and does direct damage. It also extends any vulnerable effects you have on the target, and we want to make it so it does increase damage to vulnerable targets as well. An honorable mention for Endless Fury. If you find that you need more generator, you can go for this Endless Fury, but I have a feeling you're not going to have much trouble dealing with that as well. Coming down here, we're going to go for 2 shouts that make this work really well. We're going to pick up Rallying Cry, one of the best abilities in the Barbarian kit. This is like the blood hell for barbarians. It works in almost every build. It gives you movement speed, resource generation for a good amount of time, unstoppable, which is huge on high-level nightmare dungeons where you can be CC'd and die. Rallying Cry also gives you fury and additional resource generation. We love that. Later on, if you're using this to level or early in your progress, I recommend getting the abilities first and then getting the passives. Like, work your way towards the bottom, get your legendary, get your key passive, then work your way back and get all the passives here. If you don't have full points, don't try to pick up these passives along the way. You'll need the points for other things. So we're going to get maximum life here towards the end of our build, or if you have max points. And then we're going to pick up Challenging Shout. And this gives us a lot of different things. First, it taunts the enemies and gives you big fat damage reduction. This is super good for solo play where you're going to get taking damage anyways. We make it so it gives you maximum life, which is really huge. And while it's active, you gain fury each time you take damage. So between gaining fury plus resource generation, plus Challenging Shout, giving fury every time you get attacked, on top of all that, you're going to get some pretty crazy fury generation. We're going to come down into the next category here, and anytime you run at least 1, and even more, if you run 2 or 3 shouts, Booming Voice is it's a guaranteed pickup. It's so good. So this increases the duration of all your shouts, so both of our shouts will have increased duration, and yes, that will allow us to have more movement speed, more unstoppable, and more resource generation, but also for the duration gives us more max life and damage reduction, which is huge too. You can also get damage reduction from Guttural Yell. I think in general, the DR is going to be more useful than the healing that you get from Raid Leader, but there's viability for both of these. I just think that Guttural probably wins in almost every possible scenario, just in general. Coming down into our weapon mastery tier, we're going to pick up the finisher, the Executor Rupture. What this is a weapon mastery ability that you hit enemies in front of you, you deal damage, pull your weapon out of them, and you damage them for the total amount of bleeding they currently have, and you remove that bleeding at base. So however much bleeding you've built up with all the abilities you've used so far, you rupture them, yank it out, and it's a big burst, like a blood vessel popping, where they take damage based on how much bleeding they've accrued. But When you rip on enemies, bleed rupture causes an additional explosion that deals bleeding damage. So you remove bleeding, but then apply bleeding, and we can make it so that hitting enemies with rupture increases your attack speed, which is super cool. We also get some nice passives for bleeding here. Bleeding applies slow. This just gives you a nice crowd control effect. So any target that bleeds, you can slow them, and any effects that trigger off slow, you'll have that in there as well. And your bleeding effects deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. 18% X. Much more damage. Super nice. Good to have. You also want to pick up Pit Fighter. You're going to be melee range for all of these abilities. You deal increased damage and take less damage, which is really cool. Super nice. And let's come down here to the ultimate tree. You could potentially get value here from Wrath of the Berserker, but the way this build is set up for Meat Cleaver, I think your best choice is going to be Iron Maelstrom. There's going to be a few reasons for this. First of all, when you pull out the second hit for Maelstrom, you apply bleeding, which is really nice. Remember, we apply bleeding, all of our effects scale bleeding, our damage is based on bleeding, and Rupture detonates bleeding. So all of that works really well together. And remember, we even have the Flay Scaler, which increases bleeding, so all of that works nicely together. But it means that we can run some Arsenal passives and legendaries, which we'll talk about in a second, because every time you use Maelstrom, it counts as 2 weapon swaps. And we can also set it up so Rupture uses bludgeoning or 2-hand slashing. We can make it so Ren uses 2-hand slashing, and then we can make it so Flay uses dual wield. And then with that, we can cause some major weapon swaps from that as well. I mean, this wasn't bludgeoning. This has to be slashing. So you go 2-hand here, and then dual wield, or 2-hand, dual wield. Probably that's going to be the best setup there. You also get 2-hand weapons deal increased crit strike damage. This scales gushing wounds, our key passive. When you do bleed to an enemy, you have a chance equal to your crit chance to increase the bleed amount that you apply by double of your crit damage bonus. So more crit damage means more bleeding from this passive. Super cool. And also, if you have overpowering, you can cause the bleeding to explode, dealing AoE damage, which is really nice. And we're going to be able to trigger that pretty regularly. Tempered Fury gives us max Fury, and then I like having Invigorating Fury if you can fit into the build, and it's a major spender, because every 100 Fury you heal yourself when you spend all that Fury. So that is the skill build. Let's look at the synergies here for the build itself. For Technique, the Barbarian passive, it makes perfect sense. Grab 2-handed sword. All direct damage you deal is inflicted as bleeding, and you can increase your bleeding damage when you've fully maxed out your passive at endgame. More bleeding is good. We like that. You also want to get Amethyst on your weapons for increased damage over time. This will affect your physical damage over time, which is bleeding. You get maximum life because that increases our damage as well. And then since we're in melee range, we pick up the armor. Now, in this build, I have included uniques. They are very rare. They take a while to farm. They're not impossible to farm. As you're doing Nightmare Dungeons, you will get uniques. And I like including them in builds because the synergy is there and it's something to look forward to when you're pushing into Nightmare and Torment, starting your Nightmare Dungeons. You're like, okay, I want to find this unique. It's going to make things really cool. So first, let's talk about the uniques in this build so that you know what they are and you can get excited about them and work towards them. The first one is Rage of Harrogath. This is a chest unique that has really good stats on it, but it has a lucky hit chance to reduce the cooldowns of your non-ultimate skills by 1.5 seconds when you inflict bleeding damage on elites. Well, guess what? We're bleeding elites all the time. So this is constantly checking and trying. If you get a good roll on this, you have a very high chance on lucky hit to reduce your cooldowns by 1.5 seconds, which means you get your shouts back faster, you get your rupture back faster. Super cool, nice synergy there. The other one is the one that is the most exciting for this build, and that is the 2-hand slashing weapon, Fields of Crimson. This is a beast of a sword, and remember, 2-hand slashing for 2-hand sword, we get bleeding. We want to give Rend 2-hand slashing as well. All bonuses work there, but this one is just cake. Fields of Crimson is when you use this weapon, damaging at least one enemy with your Rupture, your Bleed Detonate ability, creates a blood pool underneath the target that inflicts bleeding damage over 6 seconds, and any enemy standing in the pool takes 10% increased bleed damage. So it scales all your bleed damage. It creates an AoE bleed field, which adds more bleed, which if you do subsequent ruptures, it'll create more pools. It'll detonate for more bleeding, add more bleeding, detonate for more bleeding. So you're just this blood god that's running around destroying people. I cannot wait to run this for High Nightmare and just really see how this goes when it's all put together. For the rest of legendaries, we're going to pick up some very easy targets here. Aspect of Disobedience is an easy pickup. Anytime you are running high difficult content, consider running Aspect of Disobedience, Aspect of the Protector, and Aspect of Might. All of these are excellent for defense, and you will need them for the harder content. Earthstriker's Aspect is an interesting one. After swapping weapons 10 times, your next attack will overpower and deal increased overpowered damage. So if we set Flay to dual wield and Rend to two-hand slashing, every time we alternate counts as a weapon swap. And then when we use our ultimate, that counts as 2. Because, I mean, we can have, say you have a dual wield out, it can count as 3 as well. You switch to two-hand bludgeoning, you switch to two-hand slashing, then you switch back to dual wield. So you can actually get 3 depending on what weapon you start with, as long as you don't have bludgeoning. And then we can get those swaps there. So combine that with swapping just in general from the ultimate, plus swapping with our normal abilities, we'll get overpowers. The reason we like this is it's a very easy, reproducible way to get overpowers. And remember, every time we overpower a bleeding enemy, it creates an explosion of blood that inflicts bleeding damage over 5 seconds. Bam. So now we have pools of blood, explosions of blood, detonating blood, bleeding everywhere. Blood, 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 blood. So that one is super fun. We love having that. Iron Blood is another one, gives you damage reduction for nearby bleeding enemies. Easy, you can replace this with Aspect of Might, Aspect of Protector, or Disobedience. Those are all great choices. Aspect of Anebia is fun. Lucky hit chance, when you direct damage against a bleeding enemy, you have a chance to stun them. This by itself is nice, and remember, even if you can't stun bosses, you still deal stagger damage to them when you CC them, so you can stagger them and get bonuses from that. But what's cool about this one is Skullbreaker's Aspect. Stunning a bleeding enemy deals 40% of their total bleeding amount to them as physical damage. This is single target. It will help you with bosses and kills elites really well as well, if they can be stunned. And remember, if you stagger a boss, it's counted as all possible CCs at once. So if you stagger a boss, all of their current bleeding is going to blow up and deal damage to them with this. And then for mobbing and doing CCs and stuns, remember, you have a chance to stun anytime you hit a target that is bleeding. And when you stun them, you'll deal more damage. Helps you with mobbing. Super cool, super fun. Aspect of Encroaching Wrath is nice as well. After spending 100 Fury, your next weapon mastery skill, in this case, your Rupture, your big detonate, is going to do up to double damage. Super cool. Rapid Aspect is nice. Getting more attack speed on Flay is cool. Remember, your bleeding stacks every time you reapply it. So if you have high attack speed plus dual wield on Flay, dual wield slashing, axes, or swords, you can build up a bunch of bleeding damage, get max Fury, extend with Rend, build up, Rupture, build up, and that attack speed is going to help you get more building or more bleeding overall coming from your Flay, which is really cool. Aspect of Limitless Rage means that each point of Fury you generate while at maximum causes your next core skill, your Rend, to deal increased damage. When you scale the damage of Rend, you're also scaling the bleeding, which is really cool. So you can do a whole bunch of Flays, detonate Rend, and then delay your Rend until you have high Fury, get over max Fury, and then you can spend, get big damage on that. And remember, we have all kinds of modifiers in here. When we spend Fury, we heal ourselves. All of that's really cool. And also, after spending 100 Fury, it makes your next Rupture better, so you can Flay until max, get max on Limitless Rage, then make your Rend really big, then detonate for Rupture, and then after we spend 100 Fury on the Rend, then our next Rupture is stronger. All of it synergizes together. Aspect of Retribution is nice. Distant enemies have a chance to be stunned when they hit you, and you deal increased damage to stunned enemies. I'm not positive if Retribution will cause the stun first, and then apply the damage amplifier to them, and then you'll get the damage from Skullbreaker because they got stunned. But just keep in mind that, like, in some Nightmare dungeons, you might want to run this as an option, because especially if they're heavy in physical ranged attackers, they're going to keep stunning themselves as they damage you from ranged, and you're going to get some free damage off that as well. Lucky Hit from Slaking Aspect means you have a chance to gain 20 Fury when Rend deals direct damage to at least one bleeding enemy. More Fury means we can spend more Fury, which means more bleeds for the detonates. More Fury spent means we can do Encroaching Wrath for more bursts on Rupture. Spending more Fury means we get Limitless Rage on our Rend. All of that works really well together. So those are the legendaries. That's the skill tree. And then I've gone and made a very basic first pass on a Paragon board for you. You'll find this linked in here. You definitely want Martial increasing the shout duration. There's going to be some bleed bonuses in here as well. The hemorrhage board is very good. You also want to pick up like Mortal Draw. Skill swapping increases damage, which will increase the damage of your bleeds as well. And you have a chance to critically strike. Some super good ones in there. And you also want to pick up Disembowel for bleeding damage, things like that. So this is just here so that you can have a reference point, something to think about if you don't want to do Paragon right away, but it is just kind of a first pass on that. So that is the Meat Cleaver Barbarian Pure Bleed Detonate. And I cannot wait to run this with Fields of Crimson. It's going to be so much fun. It's going to be so cool. So if you got value in this video, leave a like down below, leave a comment. It helps me out with the algorithm. And of course, hang out with me on my live stream. I'd be happy to chat with you. If you have any questions, theory crafting ideas, or you just want to talk, then let me know. Swing by. I'd be happy to chat with you. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content. Link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.